hear my cry for truth, my cry for truth, my cry for you.
Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Hey Pastor podcast. Going to give you just a short little intro, couple of announcements before we dive back into part 2 and continue our conversation with Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity. But first, just a reminder that the videos from the question and answer should start rolling out here in the near future. That question and answer took place in January. It was a lot of fun with David Dover and Patrick Cheney and Kenneth Vaughn. You can look for those individual questions getting edited out and posted for some nice bite-sized consumption. And then we also have, I want to give some good mention to the Mentionables. They are small-time apologists, but they have a big-time message. You can go ahead and check them out at the website, thementionables.org. That is all one word, thementionables.org. They also have a conference coming up if you're in the North Carolina area, or if you just like to travel to go hear some good apologetics Christian teaching. It's going to be, I believe, in Greensboro, North Carolina in May. You can check out the website, thementionables.org, to get all the information on that. Also, go ahead and visit our website at heypastor.org. If you'd like to submit a question to have answered on this podcast, check out past episodes of the podcast or the question and answer videos as they get posted. Now we're going to pick up where we left off last time with Cameron Bertuzzi. If you have not listened to part 1, I would urge you to go do that. Get a little bit of background, a little foundation on what it is we are talking about. And then after you listen to this, go check out his website at capturingchristianity.com, where he has a lot of fantastic material, not just on Street Epistemology, not just blogs. He has regular discussions where he brings on a Christian expert and an atheist expert to talk about issues where you get both sides arguing their best case. And so those are good. He's also got a new podcast that he started recently. So go to capturingchristianity.com to check all that out. Now, let's get back to Cameron.
I want to know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I want to know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
This is one that really, I see this a lot and it kind of bugs me. They think that we'll focus on initial belief, right? Someone will say, well, believe in Jesus. Oh, well, how did you first come to believe that? And so they ask that question. Yeah, well, so why would that focus on, it's like, well, let's forget everything else that's happened in the last, 15, 20 years of your life. Tell me about when you were 13 and you first came to believe. Why was it, right? I don't know. I guess whenever I say it like that, it sounds obvious. But why would this be a bad question?
So what let me just back up a little bit. So this question, when you hear this first, when you hear them ask, how did you first come to believe in Christianity, or why do you believe this? Be very straightforward in your answer to this question if you are in dialogue with a street epistemologist. I mean, I would suggest this just more generally as well, but be very straightforward about this. So if you believe in Christianity because of the cumulative force of the evidence, say it. If it just seems right to you, then say it. If you grew up that way and have no reason to reject it, or you've been given no defeaters for Christianity, say that instead. Just be very honest about it. I mean, you don't really have a whole lot to be worried about, and from my perspective. But I mean, if we're looking at belief origins, there's something lurking that can be a really big issue, which is called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy says that just because someone has poor reasons, or there's the origin of their belief is unreliable, that doesn't mean that the belief is false. This commits what's called the genetic fallacy. We don't want to do that, but sometimes, I mean, that's not the end of the question. Some Christians actually they bring up the genetic fallacy, and they say, well, that's enough to dispel these types of questions about belief origins. But I want to say that we don't want to go that far. We want to say that It still could call into question the justification for our belief, even if it doesn't mean the belief is false. It could call into question our reasons and our justification for believing it.
Right. And I think this is one area
let me just
go
ahead.
I was going to say, I think this kind of gets back to, like we said before, where they're just trying to take you to the point of doubt, not actually finding truth. Right. So it's like, hey, why did you first believe? Well, that's a bad reason to believe. Well, okay, but that's not all there is to it. Okay, so you need to further ask questions then about whether or not the belief is true, even if your initial reason was bad.
Right. So here's an example, and this actually applies to most of our ethical beliefs. I was taught really early on that we shouldn't treat other people of different races unfairly. And I haven't really gained a whole lot of evidence in support of that since then. It's just sort of something that's been ingrained in me through culture and society. You might even want to say that I was indoctrinated to believe that we should treat people of different races fairly. But does that mean that I'm unjustified in my belief? That I should treat other people of different races fairly? I don't think so. Even though that, you could say that I was indoctrinated to believe it, even especially through culture where I live in America. There's just not a whole lot that follows from pointing out these belief origins.
Just to let's throw a bomb in there of a controversial topic. Chances are you're dealing with an atheist, you're probably dealing with a naturalist, you're dealing with someone who holds science to high regard, and so they probably believe in evolution. Most people do. But they probably did not learn about evolution from a diligent study of the evidence through scientific inquiry, right? They learned it from like PBS cartoons and Dr. Seuss. It was indoctrinated in them from a very early age. And a lot of people, if you were to dig and say, okay, well, why is evolution true? Oh, well, science says so. But they probably couldn't tell you anything. They might point, it might say something about fossils. They might say something about, dating. But they don't actually have any other real reasons because they haven't actually studied it. It was just indoctrinated to them. That doesn't mean it's false. And I guarantee you, if you were to ask that of someone, they're going to go from there straight into, but the evidence. Okay, then let's stop messing around with this question of initial belief and let's just talk about the evidence.
Yeah, and that's something that street epistemologists very generally try to avoid at all costs. They don't want to get into a discussion of the evidence because they don't find it as fruitful. In the book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, there's an entire section called Avoiding Facts, where Boghossian instructs street epistemologists to avoid discussing these facts or evidences and the reason why is because what they say is that when you start to discuss evidence and facts, there's this thing called the backfire effect. And this is actually something that's been clinically studied, where people who were entrenched in a position already when they were presented with really good facts and evidence, they just dug their heels in deeper. So talk of evidence or discussion on the evidential basis of their belief, that didn't actually move them either way. It had a negative effect. And so this is something that Boghossian should suggest that you don't do with believers. You don't do with, in your interventions, you don't discuss the evidence because it's just going to cause them to get, to dig their heels in deeper. That's one of the things that he talks about. And that's a reason why the majority of the time you don't hear street epistemologists talking about the evidence. Which is interesting. You would, I don't know. I could talk about that all day, but yeah, I think that's interesting to point out.
Well, one thing, and I don't want to paint with a broad brush the manipulation aspect. I think some are sincerely well-intended. But in a conversation I had after we got past the initial belief, and we kind of had some back and forth on whether that's justified, I mentioned, that may be why I began to believe, but since then I've learned all this other evidence. And then he just waved all that aside and said, well, but because of your initial belief, you're now invested, and because of confirmation bias, you're going to accept this evidence, which really isn't good evidence. And so the accusation, and I don't know if this is an intentional tactic, but it seemed like if they can kind of get you on the initial belief then they can say everything else after that was you defending that initial belief. Right? So not that the evidence is truly as good as you think it is. You're just fooling yourself to hold on to that cherished belief.
Yeah, forgive me when I say that. I mean, there's just no sense in which I take that as a serious response to anything.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so speculative and pretentious, really. It's just ridiculous. I mean, how do they know that? How do they know the reasons why I believe something? Even if so here I am telling them, well, hey, I don't believe that because of this. I believe it for this reason. Oh, but they know better. They know. They know why I believe. They know the psychology behind why I believe. It's very pretentious. It's very, I don't see how they could know that. It just strikes me as hand wavy, as frankly just ridiculous. So I don't, forgive me if I don't take that very seriously, but I mean, I don't really know what else to say in response to that. It just strikes me as silly.
I think it's the kind of thing that, your average person going through life, you got your family, you got your kids, you got your job, maybe more than one, you got bills to pay, you got debt to pay. I mean, you got, if it's a churchgoer and they're active, you got your volunteering over here, you got little league games, you got just all this stuff going on. So you don't really spend a lot of time just sitting around reading or thinking about these kind of things. But I mean, you can almost see the rhetorical impact if someone hasn't really thought this kind of stuff through. And so someone just told them, hey, your initial reason to believe isn't a good reason. And so they're already stopping and going, wow, wait a minute, maybe they're right. And then, all those other reasons you think are good reasons. I mean, I can almost see how someone caught unawares, rhetorically, this might kind of start to create some tension in them.
Yeah, well, there's also a distinction that you can make between, so even if the reason that I believe something is because of some bad reason, say that I just grew up that way, and let's suppose that that's a bad reason for believing something. That's compatible with there being good reasons to believe in something. And so ignoring all the evidence is not, in my opinion, that's not the way to go. I mean, right. And who is going to actually agree with that? It's like, you're not going to just dismiss all of the evidence. You're going to actually want to look at the evidence and evaluate it. And if, you can ask a question, well, is there good evidence for Christianity? And that's not a question that street epistemologists are really asking. They want to know why you believe it, and then they want to tear that reason down. They're not asking, is this a good reason, or are there good reasons to believe in Christianity? That's not a discussion you're going to have with them.
Related to this, this question focused on initial belief, but one thing that I've noticed is they want to focus on one belief, whereas as you've made reference to, and I try to teach, the truth of Christianity is bolstered by it being a cumulative case, right? So even if there's one aspect that you can kind of start to be maybe unsure about, well, there's still, all this other stuff. And so, but they want to push aside that cumulative case, get you out of that thinking, focus on one thing, and try to sow seeds of doubt in that one aspect.
Right, and you can think about it in terms of like a detective case. So a detective comes up on a crime scene, and he finds all these different pieces of evidence. There's fingerprint evidence, there's testimonial evidence. Each one of these things might not be enough to prove that the defendant is guilty, but the cumulative effect of all of the pieces of evidence might be enough to convict him. And this happens all the time.
And even if the defense attorney can come up with a good alternate explanation of how those fingerprints got there, well, that still doesn't account for the DNA and the witnesses and everything else. And so I think that's one thing that the cumulative case, to really focus on it like that, can be helpful there.
Right, and someone that I would point people to, who I think is one of the best defenders of Christianity in this sense of like this cumulative case, is Tim McGrew. Really, really look into his work if you're interested in these types of questions. He has tons of stuff on YouTube. He even has a really lengthy article defending the truth of Christianity specifically. It's really, really technical, but there's a lot of resources out there. That's one guy that I would recommend for sure to start looking into, is the work of philosopher. He's a Christian philosopher, actually teaching at a university. Timothy McGrew. Definitely look into his work.
Yeah, I have borrowed heavily from some of the work done by him and his wife for some teachings I've done at church. But brilliant stuff that goes on there. Okay, let's move on to the next. I think we about wrapped that one. I've seen a question basically asked, okay, if you didn't know, something, would you still hold that belief? So the specific one that was addressed to me was regarding the Bible. If you didn't know the author, the date, where it comes from, if all you had was just an anonymous manuscript, would you still believe that's reliable or the Word of God?
So here's something that I point out often. There are these would questions like, would you do this? What would you do in this situation? These would questions are really about psychology. These are like, what would you do psychologically speaking? What sort of steps would you take psychologically? How would you be different in your psychology? That question is separate from the epistemological question of what you should do in these situations. But oftentimes, street epistemologists, what they do is they focus on the psychology of belief rather than on the epistemology of belief. And that's an error. I mean, they call themselves street epistemologists. They should be calling themselves street psychologists. So when we ask these questions of like, what would you do? I mean, we can talk about these hypothetical situations all day long, but the real relevant question is, what should we do? And when we phrase it that way, when we ask, well, if you didn't know who the author was, what should you do? I think that puts a different spin on it.
Right.
You're going to want to look at this in a different light. The way that I've heard this question asked is if you were able to take away all of the evidence, or if all of the evidence could be explained to your satisfaction, what would you do at that point? Would you give up belief in God, or would you continue to maintain your belief as confident as you were before? And the way that I suggest responding to this, it's a ridiculously easy question to answer. So, if your confidence in Christianity is tied to the evidence in this way, then the answer is obviously going to be yes. Think about your reasons for believing that Abraham Lincoln was a real person. Now, let's ask the question, well, if we took away all of the evidence that Abraham Lincoln existed, would you still be as confident that Abraham Lincoln existed? And I think any person is going to say, well, no. If you took away all the evidence, if you think about this hypothetical scenario where we don't have any of this evidence, then yeah, obviously I'm going to think about this differently.
Right.
What follows from that? What
if the world wasn't the way it is? Would you still, no,
these questions are really different. I'm often perplexed at why these questions are taken as so
one thing I wonder, because we keep coming back to this idea of a cumulative case. Is this maybe an attempt again to isolate something, get away from the cumulative case, and just look at one piece? Okay, say you didn't have the other 20 pieces of evidence for why you believe. Would this one still make sense? And
so I think they would just frame it in terms of like, well, let's explain away all of the cumulative evidence. I think that'd be a better way to get to this question. So what I think that they're trying to do when they ask this question is they want to determine whether or not there would be a change in confidence on your part of whether or not Christianity was true. And the goal here is if you don't, so if they said, well, if we could explain away all the evidence, would your confidence change? If you answer yes, then they're like, good, okay, we're on the same page. But if you answer no, that your confidence would stay exactly the same, then they're going to really hone in and ask, well, then you believe just because of faith. You believe in Christianity just because that's what you want to believe or whatever. And so that's their way in to deriding your belief in God, is because they want to say that you just believe because of faith, which is, well, this is why I suggest, well, yeah, just answer it honestly. If they ask the question, if they took away all the evidence, what would you do? In most cases, and this is a psychological question. This is an epistemological question.
Right.
If they ask that, then you should just answer, well, think about it for a second and be like, okay, well, would my confidence change? And most people are going to say, well, yeah, my confidence would change, just like my belief that Abraham Lincoln existed. If we took away all the evidence, that'd probably change too. That's one way to respond. Now, I mean, we could go a step further, and to me, the answer to that question is going to be no. That we shouldn't lower our confidence in Christianity, but that's going to take probably too much time to explain in this interview. I would say if you want to learn more about why, I would say that visit the website and look up something called Reformed Epistemology. It's a whole branch of Christian philosophy that's really, really fascinating, really interesting, that looks at the way that God sort of created the world, if God exists, if Christianity is true, the way that God would have created humans to believe in him. He would have created in them this sense of the divine, and there's this whole story that can be told of how God engenders or creates or produces belief in God. So there's a whole lot more to say on that, but just off the bat, I mean, even for me personally, like if you said, if we took away all the evidence for Christianity in support of it, I mean, I think psychologically, I would probably lower my confidence in Christianity, even though that I'm a believer in Reformed epistemology. Psychologically speaking, I would probably lower my confidence, even though epistemologically, I would say I shouldn't lower my confidence. So,
well, and I mean, I guess I'd have to ask: does all that evidence? Are you just talking about the external evidence? Because if I still have my personal experience, God exists.
Yeah,
there's no doubt.
Right. That is something that we'd have to look at. And so if they were like, well, if you took away all your personal experience, would you still believe? Then at that point, you'd probably say, well, no. I mean, if I didn't have any experience of God, then I probably would. I mean, but again, nothing follows from this. If you took away all the evidence that Abraham Lincoln existed, it doesn't. Nothing follows. It's a hypothetical scenario. It's
right. Okay. Lastly, and this one kind of got thrown in. I wasn't originally intending it the first time I talked to you about this, but I've had a couple conversations, and one in particular that kept bringing up basically this kind of amateur armchair psychologist kind of psychoanalyzing. And specifically, one of the times it got addressed to me is he said, Mark, could it be that the reason you're pushing back so hard against this is because you are so invested in this being true? And he mentioned a few things that, I might consider a loss if Christianity were not true, one of which being, I draw a paycheck from a church. So it's kind of this kind of analyzing that, could it be that the reason you're clinging to this and arguing so hard is because, and then they give some kind of amateur psychologist reason. What would you have to say about that?
The first thing that I would say is we can assume, let's just take this for a second. Let's just assume that our beliefs aren't based on the evidence. They're based on this because we just sort of are, that's what we want to believe. We have a sense of belonging to a community. It's because we were indoctrinated to believe it or some other emotional reason. God can actually use those. Suppose that Christianity is true. Suppose that God created the world. Why couldn't he use those reasons to help us believe in God and Christianity? Like, even if we assume that this is the case, nothing really follows from that. God can use those to reliably produce belief in God, in Christians. And so the second thing that I would say is something that the atheist, I think he was a journalist, Christopher Hitchens, said that what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And so when someone says something like this and tries to point at your psychological desires or psychological reasons, emotional reasons for believing whatever you believe, if they're just asserting it without any evidence, I mean, according to Christopher Hitchens, this atheist, you can dismiss it without evidence. And so that's the second type of response. The first type, again, was just to accept it and say, well, even if that's true, God could still use that to reliably engender belief. But then secondly, what's the evidence for it? Most people just give us what's called a just so story. It's like they just tell a story of how they see these things going down. But what's the actual evidence that that's true? Now, in addition to this, and this is really where it starts to get into bizarro land, is that they have all of these explanations for why people believe in Christianity, why people believe in religion, but there's actually a whole branch of science that studies this. It's called cognitive science of religion. And this theory, the indoctrination hypothesis, these theories are just one among many theories that scientists actually go out and they test. And so when these street epistemologists are doing this, they haven't actually read, again, they haven't read any of the literature on it. They aren't familiar with the actual empirical science that's being done on it. It's just this theory is one among many, and there are better theories on offer. Let's talk about this indoctrination hypothesis a little bit. The atheist philosopher Anthony Grayling forwards it like this. He says, quote, "Remember that all this Christian teacher training is aimed at religious brainwashing of the young, not least the very young. Without brainwashing of the young, religion would wither and die of its own absurdity. The religions, all of them, depend crucially on recruitment by capturing the minds of children." And so this is the way that Justin Barrett, who's a Christian scientist, he's a cognitive scientist of religion, this is the way that he characterizes this indoctrination hypothesis. He says, quote, as initially sensible sounding as the indoctrination hypothesis may be, and though I have had it suggested to me numerous times in informal conversations or in discussion sessions after academic lectures, this hypothesis has received little attention from scholars of religion, end quote. And so here's just three basic reasons to think that this theory is not true. Three problems for it, at least. The indoctrination hypothesis is actually a caricature of what actually goes on. Most people don't threaten their children or bully them into belief. Rather, belief in God is just sort of modeled in the home. That's just what people do. They pray to God, they go to church, and they just basically generally go about acting as if the existence of God is just completely natural. That's what normally goes down.
Right.
And I know that for me, we weren't bullied into believing in God. We weren't forced or threatened into it. So this indoctrination hypothesis is more or less just a caricature. That's the first problem with it. Number two, indoctrination doesn't always work, and it can even backfire. And so I actually have a clip of my daughter that I would like to play. This is an experiment that I conducted with her earlier this morning. Let me just play it here. I've got to pull it up. I had my phone on the ground. Let me find it here. All right. So here we go.
Kimmy, who's your favorite Paw Patrol?
Dad.
No, it isn't. It's Rocky.
No.
Who's Sky's your favorite Paw? No, your favorite Paw Patrol is Rebel.
No, Sky.
You want a Pop Pop?
Sky's my favorite pop.
Sky's your favorite Pop? No, it's Rocky.
No.
Do you want a Pop Pop? Who's your favorite Paw Patrol?
Sky.
Cammy, what's your favorite color?
Pink.
No, it's blue.
No, pink.
No, your favorite color is blue.
Just kidding. My favorite color is pink.
You want a Pop Pop? What's your favorite color?
My favorite color is pink.
And so there you have it. Indoctrination, like we were trying to indoctrinate her at that point. I mean, well, it was an experiment.
Yeah.
We were just testing it out. But you can see indoctrination doesn't always work with people.
Right.
And at the beginning of this, go ahead.
I was going to say that if you're properly indoctrinating your child, Marshall would obviously be their favorite Paw Patrol.
Yeah, so this is the Paw Patrol is like a kid's cartoon, and she is in love with it. I mean, and my daughter, keep in mind, she's 2.5 years old, and she's already ready to start fighting back, even though we were asking her, well, hey, do you want a Pop Pop, which is just a little pop on her hand if she misbehaves. So she was even ready to stand up to that and say, well, no, I'm not going to believe what you're telling me to believe, even with this threat.
Yes.
So even if you threaten these consequences, it doesn't follow that they're going to believe. Right. And then the second point was that it could even backfire. And so when you threaten these horrible consequences for not believing, actually, I heard this atheist who was a deconvert from Christianity. She was saying that one of the easiest ways to avoid the emotional consequences of hell was to just not believe it exists. And so these indoctrination, if this was all that it took, if this is how people were getting people to believe, then it can actually backfire. And so there's actually no scientific evidence that this hypothesis is really the best one. And so those are two reasons. The third one is a really obvious reason, is that there's what's called a regress problem. If everyone was indoctrinated by their parents, we want to ask, well, who got it started? Who was the first person?
Right.
Someone had to get the religion ball rolling. We have to say basically that the first person who believed in religion just randomly started believing in God, and then they just started indoctrinating anyone. But this is just a horrible hypothesis. Right. Like I said, in the cognitive science of religion and literature, there are so many better theories on offer. Yet, this is the one that you hear most popularized by, even this atheist philosopher, Anthony Grayling, you hear it popularized, or you hear it touted by atheists online, you hear it touted by street epistemologists, but, again, they're just not familiar with the literature. It's really sad that you hear that.
Well, not even academically thinking, I just wonder, the people who put forth this idea of indoctrination, do they have kids? Do they not understand how kids get taught things? And I've had people tell me, there's some popular atheists out there who are pushing that religious upbringing be considered child abuse. That for children to tell, or for parents to tell their children, there is a God and you must believe this, is abusive. And I've talked to people who say, well, we're just raising our kids to kind of believe whatever they want. We're not trying to tell them what to believe. And I'm thinking, okay, if I actually believe, wholehearted, sold out, this is the reality of life. My job as a parent is to prepare my child to face the world as it exists. And if I fully believe there's a God to whom we're accountable and all that, I would actually be negligent as a parent to not teach my child that. I would actually be abdicating my role of a parent to not teach my child about God and the religion that I believe is truth.
Yeah, safe to say I agree. I don't think that there's any good reason not to teach your children these things that you are personally convinced of. I think that's, again, it's a little silly. It does strike me as someone who's going to argue this is going to be someone that doesn't have children. Okay. Well, those were 5 things that I commonly kind of have seen in my experience, limited, though it admittedly is, with street epistemology. Were there any other, kind of common things that didn't get covered that someone might want to be aware of that you can think of? Yes. So there is one question that they ask pretty commonly in these types of quote-unquote interventions. And this is what your level of confidence is that your belief is true. And this is a question that might trip up a Christian because they might think that they've got to answer a certain way about it. Some Christians think that if they don't answer that they're 100% certain that they're going to hell or that they're not a real Christian. And so what they do is they ask, well, how confident are you that your belief is true? And so the way that I suggest responding is, instead of giving like a 99% confidence or a numerical figure, instead of saying that, just say something like, well, I strongly believe it, or I firmly believe that Christianity is true, and avoid this talk of numerical figures. Again, I think when you start to talk about your confidence levels in terms of numbers, I think that's actually really difficult to do. We often mischaracterize what our actual credences are, what our confidence is actually. I don't think it's actually that easy to put a numerical figure on how confident we are. We might think that we're getting close or accurate, but who's to say? So that's why I say just say something like, I strongly believe it, or I firmly believe that Christianity is true. Well, what are your thoughts on that as a pastor? Do you think that we have to say, I'm 100% convinced that Christianity is true in order to be a Christian, or in order to get into heaven?
No, not at all. Because the fact is that if you were able to put a numerical value on your confidence, that thing's fluctuating all over the place, day to day or hour to hour, just depending on, your mood. I'll tell you, there's been times whenever some kind of hardship or something hasn't gone the way I wanted to. I mean, something big, important, and I'm angry. Well, I'll tell you what, at that moment, whenever things aren't going well, whenever things aren't going the way I thought they were going to, whenever I didn't get the blessing I thought God was sending my way, I ain't at 100%. Maybe I'm 100% belief in God because I'm shaking my fist at him. But, we have doubts. That's one thing that I, as a pastor, want to push hard on my people is it's okay to doubt. Almost every, and again, this is anecdotal, but almost every atheist I've talked to who used to be in Christianity would give me a picture of their background of being in a church where they were told, do not doubt, just have faith. You must believe. Any kind of doubt, any kind of questioning was a sign that you're not saved and you're going to hell. And that's just not true. I mean, we all have doubts. We all wrestle with things. We all have questions. We read things in the Bible that we go, oh, God, I know you're good, but I don't understand this. Right? We have moments where, whether it's because of a period of testing, maybe, or whether it's because of our own sinfulness, we've pushed away from God, that we have periods where we don't feel the presence of God. Well, we can have prolonged periods where we actually start to wonder, God, where are you? And there's all kinds of different reasons for that. And so I think that, given a numerical value, how confident are you? You know what? That's actually going to fluctuate. Maybe they're catching you on a bad day and you're like, you know what? It's kind of low. Right? Or maybe you just had a, mountaintop experience of singing, 500 verses of your favorite Chris Tomlin song with, a few hundred of your best friends, and you're just lit up, right? So 100%, absolutely. It's going to fluctuate because we have doubts. We all have doubts, and it's okay to have doubts. What's not okay is to let those doubts be an excuse to push away from God. Rather, they should be the reason why we draw close to God, seeking answers.
The last thing that I would say, which I agree with that. I
didn't mean to preach a sermon.
There's very little to disagree with there. Are you talking to somebody over there?
No.
Huh?
What? No.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought someone
came
into the room.
I was talking over you. Go ahead.
Oh.
No, I was just apologizing for getting preachy. I hadn't intended to throw a sermon out there.
No worries. So one other thing that they bring up pretty often, and this pops up in their how-to guide, the complete guide to Street Epistemology online. One of the things that they talk about a lot, and that pops up often, like I said, is this thing called the outsider test for faith. And I've written 3 articles on this, a series on it, if you want to go check it out, where I break it down into it's a very, very detailed refutation of the outsider test for faith. But I just wanted to provide 2 different tools that you can use in order to respond to this. So one of them I've already given. It's the response to equal weight theory, which says that...
Hold on, Cameron.
Yep.
Sorry, can you define what is that outsider test of faith?
Oh, right. Mm-hmm. The outsider test for faith is something like this. Actually, let me quote John Loftus, who is the original guy who put it forward. He says, "The outsider test is simply a challenge to test one's own religious faith with the presumption of skepticism as an outsider. It calls upon believers to test or examine your religious beliefs as if you were outsiders with the same presumption of skepticism you use to test or examine other religious beliefs." And he says the amount of skepticism warranted depends on the number of rational people who disagree, whether the people who disagree are separated into distinct geographical locations, the nature of those beliefs, how they originated, how they were personally adopted in the first place, and the kinds of evidence that can possibly be used to decide between them. That's basically what the outsider test for faith is. Now, and you can see why street epistemologists are going to latch on to this, because it talks about everything that they love, the number of rational people that disagree, whether those people who disagree are separated into geographical locations, the nature of those beliefs, how they originated. So the way that I suggest that you approach this question is, again, to look at well, first of all, you'd want to talk about the genetic fallacy and say, well, hey, just belief origins has nothing to do with whether the belief is true or false. And most people are going to agree that, yeah, that's true. But then we'll turn to the question of, do these belief origin types of questions actually undermine the justification that we claim to have? And so there you go to equal weight theory, which is something I already talked about earlier. If you have 5 Christians, 5 atheists in a room, equal weight theory says that both of the, or all 10 of those people have to, at that point, become agnostics, have to give up their belief. And I talked about how that theory itself is self-defeating. Not everybody agrees that equal weight theory is true. I mean, I disagree with it. So anybody listening is going to have to give up that belief, since it's not something that rationally compels everyone to believe. So equal weight theory itself, based on this kind of disagreement, that's self-defeating. And the second point that I would say is this talk of like geographical location. So, and this is a question that pops up all the time. If you were born somewhere else, say in Saudi Arabia, you probably wouldn't believe that Christianity is true. And they want to infer from this that therefore your belief is unjustified or something along those lines. And here's a really easy refutation of that. If I were born in Saudi Arabia, would I believe in equal rights? It's another question you could ask if we want to talk about these hypothetical scenarios. And I probably wouldn't believe in equal rights if I was born in Saudi Arabia. But does that mean that I'm not justified in my belief? No, it doesn't really follow. And here's another easy one. Suppose that I was born 4,000 years ago. Would I believe that the Earth is flat? And I probably would. I probably would have a different belief than I hold now. But does that mean that my belief in a round Earth is unjustified? No, it doesn't follow.
Right.
So those are two basic responses to the outsider test for faith. Like I said, I've written a whole lot more on that subject. So if you want to check that out at my website, it's a 3-part series. Just search for outsider test. You'll find it really easily. Again, this is something that I don't find very hard-hitting or persuasive. Right. From the Street Epistemologists or from John Loftus. So yeah, I think that's important to keep in mind. And as I mentioned, I've written articles on pretty much every route or every objection that you'll hear from a Street Epistemologist at this point. I've talked about how we can know that Christian belief or that Christianity is true. I've written a 4-part series on that if you want to go search for it. I've written on the question of Christianity and wish fulfillment. If talking about wish fulfillment, that Christians just want to believe in Christianity, whether or not that undermines Christian belief, I don't think it does. I've also written on the problem of religious diversity, the fact that other people believe different things around the world. And then, like I said, I've written a 3-part series on the outsider tests for faith. So, and then also, if you're interested, you want to see a little bit more of a lengthy back and forth with a Street Epistemologist, check out my conversation with a Street Epistemologist it's at the same website. Just search for it. It's really easy to find. And then in addition to that, in the future, I plan on having Tim McGrew. He's a philosopher. I plan on having him on my podcast, where we'll be breaking down some of the conversations that we find from Street Epistemologists on YouTube. Mm-hmm. So just be on the lookout for that when that pops up. But definitely that's pretty much what I have to offer in defense of the Christian view of things in response to Street Epistemology. So hopefully that helps.
I hope so. My main focus is, I've mentioned before, I'm not trying to turn, every person in the pew into a, amateur scholar and philosopher. That'd be cool if they want to do that, but to at least be able to know, hey, hold on a second. There are answers to these things, that whenever they come across challenges, whenever they come across questions that they don't know how to answer them, that maybe actually do cause a little angst, that they can at least, know, hold on a second. There are answers. I don't have to let this create a doubt. I don't have to let this be a problem for me. So even if right there at that moment, they don't have an answer, in their hip pocket, they know they're out there, and then go find them. One place they go find them is capturingchristianity.com. Lots of good stuff there. All right. Well, any other thoughts, I guess, before we wrap this up?
No, I think we've talked a lot about what the method is itself. Like I said, I think there's other things that we could say about it. The methodology itself, I think, is in a lot of ways it's unethical. It doesn't apply to everybody. It doesn't apply to every atheist that's using this method. But I think in a lot of cases it can be seen as something it's an unethical thing to do.
Right.
And again, because it can be manipulative if you're just pretending to be a nice person instead of actually treating this person in a good way because you love them or that you respect them as a human being. If you're just doing it because you want to instill doubt in them, that's unethical. So there is this question of whether or not street epistemology is unethical, and there's other things that we could talk about in that respect. But
Right.
and then on the epistemological side, I think that they have the really big issues that they haven't really thought through. They haven't really investigated on their own terms. They haven't. Most of these street epistemologists, like I said, they're just average people who have read Boghossian's book or who have read through this street epistemology guide and have watched other street epistemologists on YouTube performing these interventions. So they haven't spent much time actually evaluating whether or not the assumptions that they make going into these conversations are legitimate. They go in with assumptions just like everybody does, and I think that's something that they should start to look at and start to question. If we're talking about instilling doubt, why don't you instill some doubt in your own beliefs about your epistemology?
Absolutely.
That's a challenge to street epistemologists listening to this. If you're listening and you're a street epistemologist, start to actually read some of the literature on religious epistemology and all the advances that have been made over the last half century or so. Christian philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, William Alston. There are a lot of philosophers writing on this subject. And not all of them agree, but there's a whole lot more there than just something that we can take for granted. We can't just take for granted that this kind of staunch evidentialist epistemology is the case. And that's a technical term for your listeners. That's once we start to get into the specifics of epistemology and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's in general, that's what I would say about it. I think that there's again, this is just scratching the surface. We could talk all day about this subject, and we could talk all day about epistemology. But yeah, hopefully that's provided some insight for your listeners and my listeners as well. So anybody who's coming over to listen from Capturing Christianity, I hope that you give Marc and his podcast a subscribe and listen to his interviews that he's doing. So
Thank you.
So yeah, I think what you're doing is really awesome, Marc.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I think we've about covered it. If there's anything we didn't cover, I guess someone can submit a question on the website, heypastor.org, and maybe I might have to have you back on to clarify some stuff. So
I'd be happy to do it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll go ahead and call this a wrap. And that will bring this episode of the Hey Pastor podcast to a close. Thank you for joining me with this conversation with Cameron Bertuzzi. Be sure to check out his website at capturingchristianity.com. Lots of good stuff there. Also, be sure to visit this website at heypastor.org. Check out the podcast. Submit a question. If you have a question you'd like to ask a pastor, if you've ever just wanted to say, hey, pastor, and ask a question, now is your chance.
Hear me now, Lord, I'm calling for you to find me here, to find me here.